The summer sun beat down on the dusty streets of Willow Creek as Daisy Turner stood frozen at the edge of town, her heart hammering against her ribs at the sight of the lone rider approaching from the east. Even from this distance, she knew those broad shoulders. That particular way of sitting in the saddle like the horse was an extension of the man himself. After 8 long years, Lucas Daniels had returned to Willow Creek, and all the carefully constructed walls around Daisy's heart threatened to crumble in an instant. The year was 1876, and much had changed in the frontier town of Willow Creek, Colorado Territory. What had once been little more than a collection of hastily built structures serving as a waypoint for travelers heading west had grown into a proper town with a general store, a saloon, a small schoolhouse, and even a church with a bell that rang clear across the valley every Sunday morning. Daisy had changed too. No longer the wild-spirited girl of 16 who'd spent her days racing through meadows and dreaming of adventures, but a woman of 24 who'd learned that life rarely followed the path one hoped it would. She watched as Lucas rode closer, his black Stetson pulled low over his eyes, the same way he'd worn it when they were children playing at being cowboys and outlaws. The memory came unbidden, the two of them, breathless with laughter, carving their initials into the massive oak tree that stood sentinel at the edge of Willow Creek, the same tree where they'd sworn to be best friends forever. "Miss Turner." Lucas tipped his hat as he drew his horse to a stop before her, his voice deeper than she remembered, roughened by years of trail dust and hardship. His eyes, though those were the same clear blue that had haunted her dreams since the day he'd ridden out of town with nothing but a hastily scrawled note left behind. "Mr. Daniels," she replied, proud of how steady her voice sounded despite the riot of emotions threatening to overwhelm her. "I see you found your way back to Willow Creek." A ghost of a smile played across his lips. "Seems I have." His gaze traveled over her face, taking in the changes time had wrought. "You're looking well, Daisy." The familiar use of her given name sent a jolt through her, but she maintained her composure. "What brings you back after all this time? Last I heard, you were making quite a name for yourself down in Texas." Lucas dismounted, his movements fluid and practiced. Standing before her now, she could see the boy she'd known had become a man taller, broader, with fine lines at the corners of his eyes and a scar that hadn't been there before running along his jawline. "I had some unfinished business to attend to," he said, his gaze momentarily drifting toward the hills to the north, where the old oak tree stood. "Some things a man shouldn't leave undone." Daisy's breath caught in her throat. Surely he couldn't mean Miss Turner. The call came from behind her, and Daisy turned to see Mrs. Holloway waving from the porch of the general store. "Your order's ready when you want it." "Thank you, Mrs. Holloway," she called back, grateful for the interruption that allowed her to collect herself. When she turned back to Lucas, she'd managed to school her features into a polite mask. "Well, Mr. Daniels, I'm sure your return will be the talk of the town. Your father will be pleased to see you." Something dark flickered in his eyes. "Pa passed last winter. Telegram didn't reach me until spring." Shame washed over her. Of course he knew that would explain his return. "I'm sorry, Lucas. Your father was a good man." He nodded, a muscle working in his jaw. "That he was." After a moment of silence, he added, "I heard about your ma. Pneumonia, they said." 2 years ago, Daisy confirmed, the familiar ache of loss rising in her chest. "Pa hasn't been the same since." "And you?" Lucas asked, his voice softening. "How have you been, truly?" The question, so direct and genuine, threatened to undo her carefully maintained composure. How had she been? Heartbroken when he left without saying goodbye, angry for months afterward, then resigned as 1 year stretched into 2, and 2 into 8 with no word save for occasional rumors carried by travelers passing through. "I've been just fine, Mr. Daniels," she replied, straightening her shoulders. "Now if you'll excuse me, I need to collect my supplies. Good day to you." She turned away, feeling his eyes on her back as she walked toward the general store, her steps measured despite the urge to run. 8 years had passed, and Lucas Daniels had no right to return and upend her life after all this time. No right at all. Yet as she reached the porch steps, she couldn't help glancing back. He was still standing where she'd left him, one hand resting on his horse's neck, watching her with an intensity that made her breath catch. For just a moment, she was 16 again, laughing beneath the sprawling branches of the oak tree as Lucas carved the first letters of their names into its trunk, promising to finish it when they were older. LD plus DT, surrounded by the beginnings of a heart that had never been completed. Lucas watched Daisy disappear into the store, the set of her shoulders telling him everything her polite words had concealed. She was angry, and rightfully so. He'd left Willow Creek without a proper goodbye, too young and foolish to understand what he was leaving behind, too eager to make his mark on the world to realize what truly mattered. He led his horse, Thunder, toward the livery stable, dust kicking up with each step. The town had grown in his absence, but it still held that familiar feel that had pulled at him these last few years, growing stronger until he could no longer ignore it. After his father's death, there'd been nothing keeping him tied to the cattle outfit in Texas, nothing stopping him from finally facing the past he'd been running from. "Well, I'll be damned," came a gruff voice from the doorway of the livery. Lucas Daniels, large as life. Lucas broke into a genuine smile at the sight of the weathered face of Henry Jenkins, the town's blacksmith and livery owner since before Lucas was born. "Mr. Jenkins, good to see you're still shoeing horses and telling tall tales." The older man chuckled, stepping forward to clasp Lucas's hand in a firm shake. "And you're still as insolent as the day you left, I see. Come to visit or planning to stay?" It was the question Lucas had been asking himself since he'd first set out from Texas. "Thought I'd stick around for a while. Get my father's affairs in order." Jenkins nodded, his shrewd eyes taking in the changes in the younger man. "Your pa's place has been looked after. Foreman's been running it decent enough, though not the same without Richard there." He paused, then added, "Saw you talking with Daisy Turner." There was a question in the statement, one Lucas chose to ignore for the moment. "I'll take good care of Thunder here if you've got the space." "Always have space for a Daniels horse," Jenkins replied, taking the reins. "Your pa's place is about 3 miles out now. Town's grown right up to what used to be the eastern pasture." "I remember the way," Lucas said, retrieving his saddlebags before handing over a coin for Thunder's care. "Much else changed around here I should know about?" Jenkins considered for a moment. "Well, we've got a proper sheriff now instead of just a deputy. Train comes through twice a month. And Miss Daisy's been running the schoolhouse these past 4 years." Lucas couldn't hide his surprise at that. "Daisy's the schoolteacher? One of the finest in the territory, from what folks say. Kids adore her." Jenkins gave Lucas a knowing look. "Turned down 3 proposals in the last 2 years alone. Town's starting to think she's waiting for someone in particular." Heat crept up the back of Lucas's neck. "That's so. Just telling you how things stand," Jenkins said with a shrug. "Oh, and that oak tree you two used to play around as kids? Lightning struck it last spring. Still standing, but folks say it's dying." Lucas felt a pang at the news. That oak had been ancient when they were children, its massive trunk and sprawling branches a constant in a world that changed too quickly. He and Daisy had spent countless hours beneath its shade, climbing its lower branches, carving their initials into its bark with his father's pocket knife. "Appreciate the information," Lucas said, slinging his saddlebags over his shoulder. "I'll be back for Thunder tomorrow." As he walked through town toward his father's property, Lucas took in the changes 8 years had brought. New buildings lined what had once been a simple dirt road, their fresh paint a stark contrast to the weathered structures he remembered. Women in fashionable dresses strolled along wooden sidewalks that hadn't existed when he left, and a group of children played a game of marbles in front of what appeared to be the new schoolhouse. His father's ranch, the Double D, lay just beyond the town's new boundaries. The ride from Texas had been long, giving Lucas plenty of time to think about what he'd say when he finally arrived, what he'd do with the property now that it was his. But seeing Daisy again had thrown all his careful planning into disarray. She'd grown more beautiful than he could have imagined, her honey-brown hair caught up in a practical knot at the nape of her neck, her green eyes as vibrant as he remembered, but somehow deeper, wiser. The girl he'd left behind had become a woman, and the realization left him both awed and oddly bereft, as though he'd missed something precious in the transformation. As the ranch house came into view, Lucas paused on the rise overlooking the property. The 2-story structure stood much as he remembered, though the barn had been expanded and a new corral added to the east side. Cattle dotted the pastures beyond, and smoke rose from the chimney. indicating someone was in residence. Taking a deep breath, Lucas continued down the path. He'd come back to settle his father's affairs. Yes, but if he was honest with himself, he'd also returned for another reason entirely, one that had everything to do with an unfinished heart carved into an ancient oak tree and the woman whose initials were etched alongside his own. Daisy closed the door to the schoolhouse, exhaustion weighing on her shoulders after a long day of teaching. 23 children of varying ages and abilities demanded every ounce of her attention and energy, but she wouldn't have it any other way. Teaching had become her solace after her mother's death, a way to channel her own love of learning into something meaningful. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the schoolyard as she made her way home, her mind still dwelling on the unexpected return of Lucas Daniels. Word had spread quickly through town, as it always did in Willow Creek, and she'd spent the day fielding not-so-subtle inquiries from her students and their parents alike. "Miss Turner, is it true that Lucas Daniels has come back?" little Emma Parker had asked during arithmetic lessons. "Ma says he was your beau before he went away." The question had caused such a commotion among the older students that Daisy had been forced to rap her ruler against her desk for order. "Mr. Daniels was a childhood friend, nothing more," she'd replied firmly. Now, who can tell me the answer to problem 7? But the truth was far more complicated than what she'd told her students. Lucas had been her dearest friend, her confidant, and, in those last months before he'd left, something that had hovered on the edge of romance, unspoken but felt nonetheless. They'd been too young, really, but Daisy had known even then that what she felt for Lucas went beyond friendship. His departure had left a wound that had never properly healed, one she'd tried to ignore by throwing herself into caring for her father and later into her teaching. She'd had suitors. Of course, Willow Creek didn't have many unmarried women her age, but none had stirred in her what Lucas had with just a single glance. "Daisy, wait up." She turned to see her friend Martha hurrying toward her, skirts gathered in one hand to keep them from the dusty road. "I've been looking everywhere for you," Martha said, slightly breathless as she fell into step beside Daisy. "Is it true? Has Lucas Daniels really come back to town?" Daisy sighed. "News travels fast, I see. So it is true." Martha's eyes widened. "Have you spoken to him? What did he say? Does he look the same?" "Martha, please," Daisy said, her patience wearing thin. "Yes, Lucas Daniels has returned, presumably to settle his father's estate. We exchanged brief pleasantries, nothing more." Martha studied her friend's face with concern. "You're upset." "I'm tired," Daisy corrected. "It's been a long day of teaching, and I still have papers to grade before supper." "Daisy Turner, I've known you since we were in pigtails. You can't fool me." Martha linked her arm through Daisy's. "You haven't been the same since he left, and don't bother denying it." Daisy fell silent as they walked, knowing her friend was right, but unwilling to admit it aloud. After a moment, she asked, "Have you seen him?" Martha shook her head. "No, but Harold came back from the saloon full of stories. Says Lucas has become quite the cowboy down in Texas, working on one of the biggest spreads in the Panhandle. Says he even rode with a ranger outfit for a while, hunting outlaws." The information shouldn't have surprised Daisy. Lucas had always been restless, always dreaming of adventure beyond the boundaries of their small town. It was one of the things she'd loved about him, his boundless energy and curiosity about the world beyond Willow Creek. "Well, I'm sure he'll have plenty of admirers eager to hear his tales," she said, trying to keep her voice light. "Lily Carson was always sweet on him, if I recall." Martha gave her a knowing look. "Lily Carson is engaged to the banker's son from over in Silverton, and besides, she never stood a chance with Lucas. Not when he only had eyes for you." "That was a long time ago," Daisy said firmly, coming to a stop outside her modest home. "People change, Martha." "I certainly have." "Maybe so," her friend conceded. "But some things are constant as the North Star, and I'd wager that boys' feelings for you are among them." Daisy forced a smile. "I appreciate your concern, truly. But I've made a good life for myself here. I have my teaching, my father, my friends. I'm not the same love-struck girl who cried for weeks after Lucas Daniels rode out of town." Martha squeezed her arm gently. "Of course you're not. But maybe this is a chance to find out who you both are now, instead of holding on to who you were then." After Martha left, Daisy entered the small house she shared with her father, finding him dozing in his chair by the fire, a book open on his lap. Thomas Turner had aged dramatically after her mother's death, his once robust frame growing thinner, the spark in his eyes dimming. The only time he seemed truly present was when Daisy read to him or shared stories about her students' antics. "Pa," she said softly, touching his shoulder. "I'm home." He startled awake, momentarily disoriented before focusing on her face. "Daisy, my girl, how was school today?" "The usual chaos," she replied, pressing a kiss to his forehead before moving to the kitchen to begin preparations for their evening meal. Tommy Wilson put a frog in Sarah Miller's desk, and I had to separate the Donovan twins again for passing notes. Her father chuckled, the sound a balm to her soul. "Reminds me of when you and the Daniels boy would get into all sorts of mischief." He paused, his brow furrowing. "Strange dream I had just now. Thought I saw young Lucas riding into town, all grown up." Daisy's hands stilled over the potatoes she was peeling. "It wasn't a dream. Pa Lucas is back. His father passed last winter. Richard's gone." Thomas shook his head sadly. "We were friends for 30 years, ever since we both settled in this valley. A good man, Richard Daniels." He looked up at Daisy. "So the boy's come home to claim his inheritance?" "I suppose so," she replied, resuming her task with perhaps more vigor than necessary. "I only spoke to him briefly." Thomas watched his daughter carefully. "You know, he came to see me before he left. Asked my blessing." Daisy's head snapped up. "What?" "Said he wasn't good enough for you yet, but he would be. Said he was going to make something of himself and then come back for you." Thomas's eyes took on a faraway look. "I told him he'd better be sure, because my Daisy deserved nothing less than a man who'd move heaven and earth to be with her." The potato and knife clattered to the table as Daisy stared at her father. He never said anything to me about coming back." "Proud, like his father," Thomas said with a shrug. "Wanted to prove himself first, I reckon." "He left me a note," Daisy whispered, the memory still painful after all these years. "Said he needed to see what was beyond Willow Creek, that he couldn't stay and become his father, working the same land his whole life." "And that was true enough," Thomas acknowledged. "But it wasn't the whole truth, from what he told me. Boy had stars in his eyes when he talked about you, Daisy. Always did, from the time you were both knee-high." Daisy sank into a chair, her mind whirling with this new information. "Why didn't you ever tell me this?" Her father's expression grew sad. "At first, I thought he'd be back within the year. Then when he didn't return, I figured he'd changed his mind, found something or someone else out there. Didn't see the point in giving you false hope." He reached across the table to pat her hand. "I'm sorry, my girl. Perhaps I should have told you." Daisy shook her head, trying to process what she'd learned. Had Lucas truly intended to return all along? And if so, why had it taken 8 years? "It doesn't matter now," she said finally, standing to resume dinner preparations. "It was a childhood fancy, nothing more." But as she worked, her father's words echoed in her mind, along with the memory of Lucas standing in the dusty street that morning, his eyes finding hers across the distance, as though no time had passed at all. Lucas stood in what had been his father's study, now thick with dust and memories. The familiar scent of tobacco and leather hung in the air, fainter now, but still present enough to make his chest ache with loss. The ranch foreman, Jim Colton, had greeted him warmly upon his arrival and filled him in on the state of affairs. The herd was healthy, the summer grazing good, and the hands loyal, many having worked for Richard Daniels for years. "Your pa knew he was failing," Jim had told him, hat in hands out of respect. "Made sure everything was in order for when you returned. Said you would, eventually." Lucas had been struck by his father's faith in him, especially given the terms of their parting. Richard Daniels had been furious when his son announced his intention to leave, calling him ungrateful and short-sighted. Their last words had been heated, full of a stubborn pride that ran in both their veins. Now, Lucas ran his fingers over his father's desk, pausing at the sight of a familiar object, the pocketknife Richard had given him on his 12th birthday, the same knife he and Daisy had used to carve their initials into the oak tree. Lucas had left it behind when he rode out, a petty act of defiance he'd regretted almost immediately. Picking it up, he turned it over in his hands, the weight of it familiar even after all these years. The handle was worn smooth from years of use, first by his father and then by himself. He pressed the release, and the blade sprang open, still sharp despite the years of disuse. A knock at the study door interrupted his thoughts. Mr. Daniels? It was Elena, the housekeeper who had worked for his father for as long as Lucas could remember. Supper is ready, if you're hungry. Thank you, Elena, he replied, closing the knife and slipping it into his pocket. And please, call me Lucas. Mr. Daniels was my father. She smiled, the creases around her eyes deepening. Your father? He always said you would come home someday. Said the land was in your blood, no matter how far you roamed. Seems he knew me better than I knew myself, Lucas admitted, following her to the dining room where a simple but hearty meal awaited. As he ate, Lucas found his thoughts drifting to Daisy again. Jenkins had mentioned she was the town schoolteacher now. It suited her, he thought. She'd always been clever, devouring any books she could get her hands on, and then regaling him with stories and facts she'd learned. He remembered how she'd taught him the names of stars as they lay in the grass near the oak tree, pointing out constellations in the vast Colorado sky. After supper, despite the fatigue of his journey, Lucas found himself restless. The house felt both familiar and strange, like a shirt that no longer quite fit. Making a decision, he retrieved his hat and stepped out into the cool evening air. The walk to the oak tree would take about half an hour, he estimated. In their youth, he and Daisy had raced each other on horseback to reach it, but tonight Lucas preferred to walk, to give himself time to think about what he was doing and why. The path was still there, winding through what had once been the eastern pasture of the Double D, but was now the outskirts of town. New houses dotted the landscape, their windows glowing with lamplight in the gathering dusk. Lucas nodded to those residents who were out on their porches, noting the curious stares that followed him. As he neared the rise where the oak tree stood sentinel, Lucas felt a strange mixture of anticipation and dread. What if the tree was too damaged by the lightning strike? What if the carving had been erased by time or weather? The massive oak came into view, its silhouette stark against the darkening sky. Even from a distance, Lucas could see the damage. Jenkins had mentioned one large branch had been completely severed, and a blackened scar ran down the trunk where the lightning had struck. But the tree still stood, proud and defiant despite its wounds. As he drew closer, Lucas saw a figure standing beneath the tree, her back to him, head tilted up toward the branches above. The last light of day caught in her honey-brown hair, creating a halo effect that made his breath catch. Daisy. He slowed his approach, suddenly uncertain. What was she doing here? Had she somehow known he would come? A twig snapped beneath his boot, and Daisy whirled around, her hand flying to her throat in surprise. Lucas, she exclaimed, taking an instinctive step back. What are you doing here? I might ask you the same thing, he replied, continuing forward until he stood a few paces from her. It's getting dark. She straightened, composing herself. I often walk here in the evenings. It's peaceful. Lucas glanced up at the damaged tree. Jenkins told me about the lightning strike. I wanted to see for myself. Daisy followed his gaze. It happened during the worst storm I can remember. The whole town thought it would fall, but it's stronger than it looks. A hint of a smile touched her lips. Stubborn, like some people I know. I deserve that, Lucas acknowledged with a rueful smile of his own. Daisy turned to face him fully, the last light of day illuminating her features. Why did you really come back, Lucas? And don't tell me it was just for your father's ranch. He hesitated, weighing his words carefully. I made a promise once, to myself and to someone else. It was time I kept it. Her eyes searched his face, looking for something he wasn't sure was still visible after all these years apart. 8 years is a long time to keep someone waiting. Too long, he agreed quietly. I was young and foolish, thinking I needed to prove something before I could come back. And did you? Prove whatever it was you set out to prove. Lucas shook his head. No. Or maybe yes, but not in the way I expected. I learned that some things can't be outrun, no matter how far you go. He took a step closer to her. I learned that home isn't just a place, Daisy. It's a feeling. It's people. She remained still, but he could see the rapid pulse at the base of her throat, betraying her outward calm. You left without saying goodbye, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Do you know what that did to me? The pain in her words hit him like a physical blow. I thought it would be easier that way. For both of us. Easier. Her voice rose slightly. I waited by this tree every day for a week, thinking you'd come to see me before you left. I convinced myself you wouldn't really go without saying goodbye, not after everything we'd been to each other. Her eyes glistened in the fading light. I felt like a fool when I finally understood you were truly gone. Lucas closed his eyes briefly, the weight of his actions heavy on his shoulders. I'm sorry, Daisy. I was a coward. Yes, you were, she agreed. But some of the heat had gone out of her words. My father told me tonight that you spoke to him before you left, that you asked for his blessing. Lucas's eyes widened in surprise. He remembered that? He said you promised to come back for me when you'd made something of yourself. Her gaze was steady now, challenging. Is that true? Lucas reached into his pocket, withdrawing the pocket knife. I found this in my father's study tonight. It's the same one we used that summer day when we carved our initials in this tree. He turned toward the massive trunk, running his hand over the rough bark. Do you remember? Of course I remember, Daisy said softly. We were 16. You said we should mark the tree so that even when we were old, we'd remember this place. Lucas found the carving easily, his fingers tracing the letters that had weathered with time but remained legible. LD plus DT, surrounded by the unfinished outline of a heart. I never finished it, he said, turning back to her. I wanted to wait until I was sure. Sure of what? Sure that I deserved to finish it. Lucas took a deep breath. Sure that you'd want me to. Daisy was quiet for so long that Lucas feared he'd misread everything: her presence at the tree, the emotion in her voice, the way her eyes had followed him in town that morning. Finally, she spoke, her voice steady despite the tears that now fell freely down her cheeks. 8 years, Lucas. 8 years of not knowing if you were alive or dead, if you'd found someone else, if you even remembered me at all. Do you know how many times I've stood beneath this tree, looking at those letters and wondering what might have been? Lucas felt a tightness in his chest, a physical manifestation of the regret that had been his constant companion these past years. I wrote to you, he said, 3 times, but I never sent the letters. I told myself I needed to have more to offer: first money, a reputation, something that would make me worthy of you. I never wanted those things, Daisy said, shaking her head. I just wanted you. The simple truth of her words struck him with the force of revelation. All these years, he'd been chasing ghosts, trying to prove himself to a standard that existed only in his own mind. And now? He asked, hardly daring to hope. What do you want now, Daisy? She looked up at him, her expression unreadable in the gathering darkness. I want to know if the boy who carved his initials next to mine still exists somewhere inside the man standing before me. Lucas closed the distance between them, slowly enough that she could have stepped away if she wished. When she didn't, he reached out to gently wipe a tear from her cheek. He does, Lucas said softly. Older, maybe a bit wiser, definitely more aware of what matters in this life. But still yours, Daisy. Always yours, if you'll have him. For a moment, the only sound was the gentle rustle of leaves overhead and the distant call of a nighthawk. Then Daisy moved, closing the last space between them, her hand coming up to rest against his chest. Show me, she whispered. Finish what you started, Lucas Daniels. Understanding her meaning, Lucas turned toward the tree, opening the pocket knife with practiced ease. In the deepening twilight, he carefully traced the original lines of the heart, deepening them before completing the shape that had remained unfinished for 8 long years. When he was done, he stepped back, admiring the now complete carving that stood in testament to a love that had endured separation and time. LD plus DT, encompassed within a perfect heart. There, he said, turning back to Daisy. Now it's finished. She shook her head, a small smile playing on her lips. No, Lucas. Now it's just beginning. And in the shadow of the ancient oak that had witnessed the promise of their youth, Daisy Turner rose on her tiptoes and kissed the man she'd never stopped loving, sealing a different kind of promise, one that neither time nor distance would ever break again. The next morning dawned clear and bright, the early summer sun casting long shadows across the land as Lucas made his way back to town. He'd spent the night at the ranch, but sleep had eluded him, his mind too full of Daisy, the softness of her lips against his, the forgiveness in her eyes, the way she'd fit perfectly in his arms as if the years apart had never happened. They'd stayed beneath the oak tree until the stars came out, talking of everything and nothing, beginning the long process of relearning each other. Daisy had told him of her life in his absence, her mother's illness and passing, her decision to become a teacher, her refusal of several marriage proposals from men who'd never stirred her heart the way he had. In turn, Lucas had shared stories of his travels, the cattle drives from Texas to Kansas, the brief, violent period riding with the Rangers, the gradual realization that the adventure he'd sought hadn't filled the emptiness inside him. I kept thinking the next town, the next job, the next horizon would be the one to make me feel complete, he'd confessed as they sat with their backs against the oak's massive trunk. It took me too long to understand that what I was looking for wasn't out there at all. Now, as he approached the livery to collect Thunder, Lucas felt a lightness in his step that had been absent for years. He and Daisy had agreed to take things slowly, to give themselves time to rediscover each other as the adults they'd become. She would continue teaching until the end of the school term, 2 weeks away, and he would focus on restoring the Double D to its former prosperity. "Well, look what the cat dragged in," Jenkins called from inside the stable as Lucas approached. "Thought you might have changed your mind and headed back to Texas already." Lucas grinned at the old blacksmith. "And miss out on your charming conversation? Not a chance." Jenkins chuckled, leading Thunder out into the morning light. The black gelding nickered in greeting, nudging Lucas's shoulder with his velvety nose. "Seems like you found what you were looking for yesterday," Jenkins remarked casually, his shrewd eyes missing nothing. "Word around town is you and Miss Turner were seen walking back from the old oak tree well after dark." Lucas shook his head in amusement. "Does anything happen in this town without everyone knowing about it within the hour?" "Nope," Jenkins replied cheerfully. "And folks are mighty interested in this particular development. Been taking bets for years on whether you'd ever come back for her." "Is that so?" Lucas asked, checking Thunder's saddle before mounting. "And who won?" "Martha Simmons. Bet you'd be back within 10 years. Cut it mighty close, I'd say." Jenkins handed him the reins. "You heading back to the ranch?" Lucas nodded. "Need to talk to Colton about the herd. Thought I might move some of the cattle to the south pasture. Give the eastern grazing land a rest." "Sounds like you're planning to stay a while," Jenkins observed. "I am," Lucas confirmed, settling into the saddle. "For good, if I have my way." As he rode toward the schoolhouse, Lucas considered the changes that had swept through his life in just 24 hours. Yesterday morning, he'd been a drifter with a destination but no real plan beyond settling his father's affairs. Now, he found himself contemplating a future in Willow Creek, one that included the woman he'd never truly stopped loving despite his best efforts to forget her. The schoolhouse sat at the edge of town, a neat white building with a small bell tower and a yard where children played during their midday break. As Lucas approached, he could hear Daisy's voice through the open windows, clear and strong as she led her students in reciting multiplication tables. Not wanting to interrupt the lesson, Lucas dismounted and tethered Thunder to a hitching post, content to wait until the children were dismissed for lunch. He hadn't planned to visit her at the school, but found himself drawn to her like a compass needle to true north, unable to go about his day without seeing her again. Through the window, he caught glimpses of her moving about the classroom, her hair caught up in the same practical knot as yesterday, though several tendrils had escaped to frame her face. She wore a simple blue dress, modest and appropriate for a schoolteacher, yet Lucas thought she'd never looked more beautiful. The ringing of the lunch bell startled him from his reverie, and moments later the door burst open as children of various ages spilled out into the yard, their voices raised in excitement at the prospect of play. Several of them noticed him immediately, pointing and whispering among themselves. A boy of about 10 approached boldly, studying Lucas with undisguised curiosity. "Are you Lucas Daniels?" he asked, his freckled face serious. "The one Miss Turner used to know?" Lucas raised an eyebrow. "I am. And who might you be?" "I'm Tommy Wilson," the boy declared. "Miss Turner says I'm a troublemaker, but I just like to have fun. Did you really fight Indians and outlaws down in Texas?" Before Lucas could respond, Daisy appeared in the doorway, her expression shifting from surprise to pleasure at the sight of him. "Tommy Wilson, are you bothering Mr. Daniels?" she called, though her eyes remained on Lucas, a warmth in them that made his heart race. "No, madam," Tommy replied. Just asking him if he really fought Indians and outlaws like everyone says. Daisy shook her head, amusement playing at the corners of her mouth. Mr. Daniels is not here to entertain you with wild stories. Now go eat your lunch before your time is up. The boy scampered off, joining his friends who were now openly staring at Lucas with fascination. I'm sorry about that, Daisy said as Lucas approached the schoolhouse steps. The children have been full of questions since word spread about your return. No need to apologize, Lucas replied, removing his hat as he came to stand before her. Though I'm curious what tales are being told about my adventures. A faint blush colored her cheeks. Nothing too outlandish, I hope. Martha's husband claims you single-handedly drove off a band of Comanche raiders from a settler's homestead. Lucas chuckled. That's giving me far too much credit. There were 5 of us rangers, and we merely escorted the Comanche back to their reservation after they'd wandered onto disputed territory. He studied her face in the clear light of day. You look beautiful this morning, Miss Turner. Her blush deepened, but she met his gaze steadily. Flattery, Mr. Daniels? Before noon. Just speaking the truth, he said with a smile. I hope you don't mind me stopping by. I was on my way to the ranch and found myself taking a detour. I don't mind, she admitted, glancing at her students who were pretending not to watch them with rapt attention. Though I'm afraid we have an audience. Lucas followed her gaze, noting the poorly concealed interest of the children. Perhaps I could call on you properly this evening? I thought you might like to see the ranch, how it's changed. I'd like that, Daisy replied. Pa usually dozes off after supper. I could come by around 7. A bell chimed from inside the schoolhouse, signaling the end of the lunch break. Daisy turned to call her students, who reluctantly began making their way back inside, many still casting curious glances at Lucas. I should go, she said, though she made no move to leave. 7 o'clock, Lucas confirmed, resisting the urge to take her hand in full view of her students. I'll be waiting. As he mounted Thunder and rode toward the ranch, Lucas found himself planning the evening ahead which parts of the property to show her, what improvements he intended to make, how to make the old place feel like home again. For the first time since his return, the Double D felt like more than just an inheritance or an obligation. It felt like a beginning. The day passed in a flurry of activity as Lucas worked alongside the ranch hands, inspecting the herd, discussing breeding plans with Colton, and assessing what repairs the house and outbuildings needed after the harsh Colorado winter. By late afternoon, his shirt was soaked with sweat and his muscles ached from unaccustomed labor, but he felt more alive than he had in years. After a quick wash in the creek that ran through the property, Lucas changed into fresh clothes and made his way to the kitchen, where Elena was preparing the evening meal. Elena, he began, uncharacteristically nervous. I've invited someone to visit this evening. Miss Turner, from town. The housekeeper's eyes lit up with understanding. Ah, you're Daisy. I remember her well. Such a sweet girl, always with her nose in a book. She gestured to the stew simmering on the stove. I will make extra, and perhaps some of those sweet biscuits she used to like. Lucas smiled gratefully. That would be perfect. Thank you. As 7 o'clock approached, Lucas found himself pacing the front porch, watching the road for any sign of Daisy. The sun hung low in the western sky, casting a golden glow over the land that stretched before him, his land now. He reminded himself, still adjusting to the idea of being responsible for the Double D and the people who depended on it. The sound of hoofbeats drew his attention, and Lucas's heart quickened at the sight of Daisy approaching on a chestnut mare. She rode astride rather than side saddle, her skirts hitched up to reveal practical riding boots, her hair loose and flowing behind her like a banner in the evening breeze. The sight of her, so natural and at ease on horseback, reminded Lucas of their childhood races across these same fields. He stepped off the porch to meet her as she drew her horse to a stop before the house. You remembered the way, he said, reaching up to help her dismount. Daisy's hands rested lightly on his shoulders as he lifted her down, her eyes meeting his with a warmth that made his pulse race. Some paths are impossible to forget, she replied, her voice soft. For a moment, they stood close, his hands still at her waist, hers still on his shoulders, the years between them melting away in the golden light of the setting sun. Then, remembering where they were, Lucas reluctantly stepped back, offering her his arm instead. I thought we might walk the property before dinner, he suggested. There's something I want to show you. Daisy tucked her hand into the crook of his elbow. Lead the way. They strolled past the barn and corrals, Lucas pointing out the changes his father had made in recent years: the new windmill that drew water from the deep well, the expanded hay barn, the improved fencing that had reduced cattle losses during the harsh winters. Daisy listened attentively, asking questions that revealed her own knowledge of ranch operations, gleaned from a lifetime in ranching country. "Your father built all this himself?" she asked as they paused by a particularly well-constructed section of fence. Lucas nodded, a familiar pang of regret squeezing his chest. "With his own hands, most of it. He never was one to sit idle, even as he got older." He hesitated, then added, "I should have been here to help him." Daisy squeezed his arm gently. "You're here now? That's what matters." They continued walking, cresting a small rise that offered a view of the entire ranch spread out before them, from the house and outbuildings to the lush pastures where cattle grazed, their forms dark against the verdant grass. Beyond, the mountains rose in majestic splendor, their peaks still capped with snow even in early summer. "This was always my favorite view," Lucas said, stopping to take in the panorama. "When I was a boy, I'd come up here when I was angry or confused, and somehow the sight of all this would put things back in perspective." "It's beautiful," Daisy agreed, her gaze following his across the landscape. Lucas turned to face her. "This is what I wanted to show you, Daisy. All of it. Because I'm hoping." He took a deep breath, steeling himself. "I'm hoping you might consider sharing it with me. Not right away," he added hastily, "but someday, when you're ready. When we're both ready." Daisy's eyes widened. "Lucas, are you not proposing?" he assured her quickly. "Not yet. We have time now, time to relearn each other. But I want you to know my intentions. I came back for the ranch, yes, but more importantly, I came back for you." Daisy studied him, her expression thoughtful. 8 years is a long time, Lucas. We're different people now than we were at 16. "I know," he acknowledged, "and I don't expect things to be the same. But what I feel for you that hasn't changed. If anything, it's grown stronger with time and distance." He took her hands in his. "I'm not asking for promises, Daisy. Just a chance." She was quiet for a long moment, her gaze drifting back to the vista before them. Then, slowly, she nodded. "A chance," she agreed, her voice soft but certain. "That seems fair." Relief and joy surged through Lucas, and he raised her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "That's all I ask." The weeks that followed took on a rhythm that felt both new and familiar. Lucas threw himself into the work of the ranch, learning from Colton and the other hands what his father had planned for the property, making his own decisions about its future. Daisy finished the school term, preparing her students for the summer break and considering whether to continue teaching when classes resumed in the fall. Each evening, Lucas would ride into town to escort Daisy on walks through Willow Creek or out to the old oak tree, which was showing signs of new growth despite the lightning damage. On Sundays, they attended church together, ignoring the knowing glances and whispers from the townspeople who had watched their childhood friendship blossom into something more. Thomas Turner, initially wary of Lucas's return, gradually warmed to him again, especially after Lucas began spending time with the older man, listening to his stories and helping with repairs around the Turner home. "He's trying, Daisy," Thomas told his daughter one evening after Lucas had left. "Man doesn't replace a whole roof for someone he doesn't care about." Daisy smiled, remembering how Lucas had worked through the hottest part of the day, refusing to stop until the job was done. "I know, Pa. And how do you feel about him?" Thomas asked, his gaze shrewd despite his declining health. "Has he earned his second chance?" Daisy considered the question carefully. Over the past weeks, she'd seen Lucas's determination to make amends, not just with her, but with the entire community. He'd thrown himself into ranch work with a dedication that would have made his father proud, hired 2 young men from town who desperately needed the work, and even volunteered to help rebuild the church steeple damaged in the same storm that had struck the oak tree. More importantly, he'd been patient with her, understanding her need to guard her heart after the pain of his previous departure. He'd courted her properly, with respect and tenderness, never pushing for more than she was ready to give. "Yes," she said finally, meeting her father's eyes. "I believe he has." As summer reached its peak, The town of Willow Creek prepared for its annual Independence Day celebration. Banners in red, white, and blue hung from the storefronts, and a dance floor was constructed in the town square. It was the social event of the season, drawing ranchers and townspeople from miles around for a day of games, food, music, and dancing under the stars. On the morning of the celebration, Lucas arrived at the Turner home earlier than usual, a wrapped package tucked under his arm. "You're early," Daisy remarked as she opened the door, still pinning up her hair for the day. "The festivities don't start until noon." Lucas smiled, his eyes taking in the sight of her with undisguised appreciation. "I wanted to give you something before we join the crowds." He held out the package. "A gift, if you'll accept it." Curious, Daisy invited him inside and unwrapped the parcel to reveal a book, a beautiful leather-bound collection of poetry by Elizabeth Barrett Browning, the pages edged in gold leaf. "Lucas," she breathed, running her fingers reverently over the cover. "This must have cost a fortune." "Open it," he urged gently. Daisy complied. An oppressed flower fell from between the pages, a perfect columbine blossom, Colorado's state flower, preserved at the height of its beauty. "I picked it near the oak tree," Lucas explained as she lifted it carefully, "to remind you of where we began and where we found each other again." Tears pricked at Daisy's eyes as she looked up at him. "It's perfect. Thank you." He took her hand, his expression growing serious. "There's something else I want to ask you, Daisy. These past weeks have been the happiest of my life, and I hope they've brought you some measure of happiness too." "They have," she assured him, her heart beginning to race at the intensity in his gaze. "Then I was hoping you might do me the honor of saving me the last dance tonight." A smile played at the corners of his mouth. "And perhaps every dance after that, for as long as we both shall live." Daisy's breath caught in her throat as she realized what he was asking. "Lucas, are you?" He dropped to one knee before her, still holding her hand in his. "Daisy Turner, I've loved you since we were children carving our names into that old oak tree. I was a fool to leave you once, but I swear I'll never make that mistake again." From his pocket, he withdrew a ring, a delicate band of gold set with a single perfect diamond that caught the morning light. "Will you marry me and make the Double D our home?" Tears of joy spilled down Daisy's cheeks as she nodded, words momentarily beyond her. When she finally found her voice, it was steady and sure. "Yes, Lucas Daniels. Yes, I will marry you." His face lit with a joy that matched her own as he slipped the ring onto her finger, then rose to take her in his arms, sealing their promise with a kiss that spoke of all the years behind them and all the years yet to come. Later, as they made their way toward town for the celebration, Daisy suggested a detour. "Let's stop at the oak tree," she said. "I'd like to see it today." Lucas readily agreed, guiding their horses toward the familiar rise where the ancient oak stood. As they approached, Daisy noticed something different about the tree. A small fence had been erected around its base, protecting it from grazing cattle and giving the new growth room to flourish. "You built this," she said, recognizing Lucas's handiwork in the carefully constructed barrier. He nodded, helping her dismount before tethering their horses to a nearby post. "Thought the old tree deserved a fighting chance after surviving that lightning strike. Colton says with proper care, it could live another 100 years. They walked hand in hand to the massive trunk, where their carved initials stood as testament to a love that had endured separation and time. Lucas traced the finished heart with his fingertips, smiling at the memory of that night 2 months ago when he'd finally completed what he'd begun 8 years earlier. "I was thinking," he said, turning to face Daisy, "that we might be married here beneath this tree, if you'd like that." Daisy's heart swelled with love for this man who understood so perfectly what would mean the most to her. "I can't imagine anywhere more perfect," she replied, stretching up to kiss him softly. As they rode into town for the Independence Day celebration, Daisy couldn't help but reflect on the journey that had brought them to this moment. 8 years ago, she had stood watching Lucas ride away, her heart breaking with each hoofbeat that carried him farther from Willow Creek. Now, he rode beside her, their future stretching before them as vast and promising as the Colorado sky. The town square was already bustling with activity when they arrived, colorful bunting fluttering in the summer breeze as children raced between game booths and food tables laden with pies, cakes, and savory dishes contributed by every family in the area. "Daisy, Lucas," Martha called, waving from where she stood with her husband near the lemonade stand. As they approached, her sharp eyes immediately spotted the ring on Daisy's finger, and she let out a squeal of delight that drew the attention of everyone nearby. "You're engaged. Oh, Daisy, I'm so happy for you both." Word spread quickly through the crowd, and soon they were surrounded by well-wishers offering congratulations. Thomas Turner watched from his seat beneath a shady elm, his eyes bright with unshed tears as he nodded his approval to Lucas. "When's the wedding to be?" Mrs. Holloway asked, patting Daisy's hand affectionately. "September," Lucas answered, his arms slipping around Daisy's waist. "Under the old oak tree, if Reverend Phillips is willing." "Nothing would give me greater pleasure," the Reverend assured them, having joined the growing circle of friends and neighbors. "That tree has seen the beginnings of your love. It seems only fitting it should witness your vows as well." As the day progressed into evening, lanterns were lit around the dance floor, and the town's small band struck up a lively tune. Lucas led Daisy onto the wooden platform, his movements surprisingly graceful for a man who'd spent most of his adult life in the saddle. "You've learned to dance properly," Daisy observed as he guided her through the steps with confidence. "I remember you stepping on my toes at every spring social." Lucas laughed, the sound rich and warm. "Had to learn a few things in my travels to impress you when I returned," he admitted, "though I'm still better on horseback than on a dance floor." They danced until the stars came out, pausing only to share cool drinks and quiet conversations with friends. As promised, Lucas claimed the last dance of the night, holding Daisy close as the band played a slow, sweet melody that seemed to speak directly to their hearts. "Happy," he murmured against her hair. "More than I ever thought possible," she replied, resting her head against his chest, feeling the strong, steady beat of his heart. "And you?" "I found everything I was looking for," Lucas said simply. "Everything I ever needed was right here all along." As summer gave way to the golden beauty of September, preparations for the wedding consumed the town of Willow Creek. Women gathered to help Daisy sew her wedding dress, a creation of ivory silk and delicate lace ordered specially from Denver. Men from the Double D Ranch and surrounding properties worked together to clear the area around the oak tree, creating a natural cathedral beneath its spreading branches. The day before the wedding, Lucas found himself standing alone beneath the oak, marveling at the transformation. Wooden benches had been arranged in neat rows, and an arbor crafted from willow branches stood where he and Daisy would exchange their vows. Lanterns hung from the lower branches, ready to be lit as evening fell. "Your father would be proud," came a voice behind him, and Lucas turned to see Thomas Turner approaching slowly, leaning heavily on his cane. The older man's health had declined over the summer, but he had insisted on walking his daughter down the aisle, refusing even to consider being wheeled to the ceremony. "I hope so," Lucas replied, moving to offer Thomas his arm for support. "I've tried to honor his memory in everything I've done since returning." Thomas nodded, his gaze traveling over the wedding preparations. "Richard and I used to talk about you and Daisy, you know. Even as children, there was something special between you two. We thought maybe someday." He shook his head, smiling at the memory. "Well, it took longer than we expected, but here we are." "Here we are," Lucas agreed, glancing at the carved heart on the tree trunk, now decorated with fresh flowers for the upcoming ceremony. "I wish he could be here tomorrow." "He will be, in his own way," Thomas assured him, patting Lucas's arm. "Just as Catherine will be with Daisy. Some bonds transcend even death." He looked up at Lucas, his eyes suddenly serious. "Promise me you'll take care of my girl when I'm gone. Won't be long now, I reckon." Lucas felt a lump form in his throat at the older man's words. "I promise, sir." "With everything I am." Thomas nodded, satisfied. "Good. That's all a father can ask for." He glanced back toward town. "Now help an old man back to his house. I need my rest if I'm to walk my daughter down the aisle tomorrow." The wedding day dawned clear and perfect, the September sky a deep, cloudless blue that seemed to promise nothing but happiness for the couple who would pledge their lives to each other beneath the ancient oak. By mid-afternoon, the entire town of Willow Creek and surrounding ranches had gathered, dressed in their Sunday best, excitement rippling through the crowd as they awaited the arrival of the bride. Lucas stood beneath the willow arbor, nervously adjusting the cuffs of his new suit as Reverend Phillips offered quiet words of encouragement. Though he'd faced cattle rustlers and wild storms on the open range without flinching, the prospect of publicly declaring his love for Daisy before the entire community had his heart racing like a green colt. The murmur of the crowd suddenly hushed, and Lucas looked up to see Martha approaching along the path from town, a signal that the bride was ready. The small band, positioned to one side of the gathering, began to play a sweet, familiar melody that carried on the gentle breeze. And then she was there, appearing at the end of the aisle on her father's arm, and Lucas forgot how to breathe. Daisy's gown caught the late afternoon sunlight, the ivory silk gleaming like pearl against her sun-kissed skin. Her honey-brown hair was adorned with wildflowers and fell in soft waves down her back, just as it had the day he'd first seen her upon his return to Willow Creek. Their eyes met across the distance, and in that moment, everything else faded away: the watching crowd, the music, even the towering oak above them. All Lucas could see was Daisy. All he could feel was the love that had guided him back to her, across miles and years and all the mistakes of youth. Thomas walked his daughter slowly down the aisle, his steps carefully measured but his head held high with pride. When they reached the arbor, he placed Daisy's hand in Lucas's, his eyes bright with emotion. "Take care of each other," he said simply before taking his seat in the front row. Reverend Phillips began the ceremony, his voice carrying clearly to all assembled. He spoke of love's endurance, of promises kept and faith rewarded, of two lives joining as one beneath the same tree where, as children, they had first carved their names together. When the time came to exchange vows, Lucas took both of Daisy's hands in his voice steady and sure. "Daisy Turner, I have loved you since before I knew what love truly meant. I left once to find myself, only to discover that the best part of me had always been right here with you. Today, I promise to stay by your side through whatever life brings us, to cherish you above all others, to create a home with you filled with love and laughter. This I vow, with all my heart, until my last breath." Tears glistened in Daisy's eyes as she responded, her voice clear despite the emotion that threatened to overwhelm her. "Lucas Daniels, you have been my dearest friend, my greatest heartbreak, and my truest love. Today, I promise to walk beside you on whatever path life leads us down, to support your dreams as you have supported mine, to build our future together day by day. This I vow, with all my heart, until my last breath." They exchanged rings, a simple gold band for Lucas, and a delicate one that matched Daisy's engagement ring. As Reverend Phillips pronounced them husband and wife, the setting sun broke through the branches of the oak tree, bathing them in golden light that seemed like a blessing from above. "You may kiss your bride," the Reverend said with a smile. Lucas cupped Daisy's face gently between his hands, looking into her eyes with all the love he'd carried for her across the years. "Hello, Mrs. Daniels," he whispered, before lowering his lips to hers in a kiss that sealed their vows and promised a lifetime of tomorrows. The crowd erupted in cheers and applause, hats thrown into the air in celebration. As they turned to face their friends and family, now husband and wife, Lucas caught sight of the carved heart on the oak tree, complete at last, just like the circle of their love. 10 years later, on a warm summer day much like the one when Lucas had first returned to Willow Creek, he stood beneath the oak tree watching as his twin daughters, Catherine and Emma, raced each other across the meadow that stretched before the Double D Ranch house. At 7 years old, they were the image of their mother, with honey-brown hair that caught the sunlight and spirits as wild and free as the Colorado wind. "Papa, look how fast I can run," called Catherine, the elder by 5 minutes and forever determined to prove herself the quicker of the two. "I see you, darling," Lucas called back with a smile. "Both of you are quick as rabbits." The sound of approaching hoofbeats drew his attention, and his heart quickened at the sight of Daisy riding toward him, their 3-year-old son Thomas secured before her in the saddle. Even after a decade of marriage, the sight of his wife still filled Lucas with a wonder and gratitude that never dimmed. "Mama's back," Emma cried, changing direction to race toward the approaching riders. Catherine followed, their competitive race forgotten in the joy of their mother's return. Lucas walked to meet them, lifting Thomas from the saddle and setting him on his shoulders before helping Daisy dismount. "How was town?" he asked, leaning in to kiss her softly. "Busy," she replied, returning his kiss before turning to embrace their daughters who danced impatiently around them. "Mrs. Holloway sends her regards, and I've invited Martha and Harold for dinner next Sunday." As the children scampered off to play, Daisy slipped her hand into Lucas's, and together they walked toward the oak tree that had witnessed so many pivotal moments in their lives. The lightning scar was still visible on its trunk, but the tree had not just survived, it had thrived, putting forth new branches and leaves with each passing year, growing stronger for having weathered the storm. Much like their love, Lucas thought, which had only deepened through the challenges they'd faced together. Thomas Turner's peaceful passing 3 years after their wedding, the difficult twin birth that had nearly taken Daisy from him, the harsh winter that had decimated half their herd and forced them to start anew. "What are you thinking about?" Daisy asked, noticing his contemplative expression. Lucas smiled, drawing her close. "About how lucky I am. About how every day with you is a gift I never deserved, but will spend my life being thankful for." Daisy laid her head against his shoulder, her body fitting perfectly against his side as they watched their children play in the shadow of the ancient oak. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked softly. "Coming back, settling down here instead of continuing your adventures?" Lucas shook his head without hesitation. "Never. Everything I was looking for, I found right here." He turned to face her, tucking a stray strand of hair behind her ear with gentle fingers. "You are my greatest adventure, Daisy Daniels. You always have been." As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, casting long shadows across the land that had been in the Daniels family for 2 generations and would pass to a third, Lucas and Daisy remained beneath the oak tree, their hands entwined, their hearts beating as one. And there, carved into the trunk above them, the heart that Lucas had finally completed on that fateful evening of his return still stood LD. Plus DT, a testament to a love that had begun in childhood, endured through separation, and blossomed into a life filled with more joy than either could have imagined when, as children, they'd first carved their names into the ancient oak.